knows too much.
The post-World War I generation was turned against Jews in many ways and on many levels, but mostly through Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, both of whom demeaned the culture whenever possible. These were the two most influential novelists when novels were an influence. At the time, Jews were not integrated into high society, not allowed to join country clubs or fraternities, the oligarchy. Instead, rich Jews had their own aristocracy centered on families holding stock in the Federal Reserve, the ones who also owned some of the biggest investment banks, the ones linked to names like Rothschild and Warburg. This division between these two powerful oligarchies along the eastern seaboard was intentional and in place prior to the Civil War. They are still separate in some quarters. I suspect Revelo P. Oliver worked for the OSS during World War II. He was a brilliant intellectual and mastered a dozen languages and was considered an expert in the origins of religion. He taught at the University of Illinois, where I grew up, evolving into a major player on the national stage. Residing walking distance from campus on Ohio Street, Oliver could be seen slouching off to his office in the classics department, wearing an enormous black fedora and ankle-length trench coat, looking like a parody of an intelligence operative. His vicious letters to the editor of the News Gazette probably served mostly to recruit members to the local lodge of the John Birch Society, an organization Oliver had a hand in creating. Soon, however, his buddy, William Buckley, a boner from Yale who ran the National Review, dropped Oliver as a contributor. And then the Birch Society began purging the most virulent racists off their rolls, of which Oliver was the ringleader. Oliver responded by publishing evidence the Birchers had been overrun by the same Jews manipulating the State Department, United Nations, and worldwide communist conspiracy. During Halloween, local children in his neighborhood collecting donations for UNICEF were warned in advance to steer a wide berth from his block lest they cross his path and engender a political rant on the evils of globalism. When my sister was reading Nancy Drew, she and Connie Marshall, whose dad became a federal judge, went all around the Oliver's house tapping the walls for secret entrances, recalls Mary Gates de Rosier. Mrs. Oliver had a funeral for her dog and invited the neighbors. My mom went and told us that the dog was laid out on the sofa surrounded by flowers. Mrs. Oliver was always giving us flyers about the dangers of Coca-Cola and of fluoride in the drinking water. Oliver moved on by creating the National Alliance, now known as the National Vanguard, the wellspring from which many generations of terrorists with strange links to intelligence operations have sprung. Funny how nobody writes or talks about Oliver today except his supporters, even though his role as a spook propagandist should be obvious with hindsight. Soon after JFK's assassination, Oliver published a dissenting opinion claiming JFK was a communist who'd been murdered by the communists because he decided to go American. He claimed Lee Harvey Oswald had been trained by the KGB and the Warren Commission had been preordained to claim Oswald was a lone assassin. This was published after the commission was announced, long before the 888-page report appeared. Oliver's theory was peppered with distortions and outright fabrications, as well as some amazing secret truths, evidence of inside sources. The government, especially the State Department, was heavily penetrated by a secret communist conspiracy run by Jews, claimed Oliver, and as evidence he cited the impossibility of a Marine formerly posted at our most secret base in Japan, defecting to Russia, and then freely returning to America, and yet not monitored by the FBI. This could happen only if the State Department was infested with cooperating communist conspirators, claimed Oliver. Ignoring the more obvious explanation, Oswald was an American spook who was returning from a failed penetration operation in Russia. The identification of the murderer was a near miracle, if not the result of divine intervention. It was the result of a series of coincidences of the same order as we might enable a bum with $1 in his pocket to enter a casino in Reno and emerge with 1,000. Noted Oliver in another one of his many spot-on assessments. This miraculous identification and capture of Oswald began with the murder of Officer J.D. Tippit. Oswald's wallet was discovered at the scene along with 4 spent cartridges from his revolver. Strange Oliver could recognize the anomaly of Oswald's strangely trouble-free re-entry into the USA after supposedly defecting to the enemy, but missed this highly improbable wallet, especially considering Oswald was captured an hour later with a wallet in his pocket and a revolver that didn't seem to work, which means the wallet at the scene must have been planted. There's also the witnesses to the Tippett slaying, who claimed Oswald was not the man they saw fleeing the crime. The only other option is believing the official story. Oswald murdered Tippett, then calmly emptied his revolver, tossed his wallet on the ground, and fled the scene. Found a new wallet with ID, found a new revolver that didn't function, and discarded his working revolver, which is the version Oliver opted for in this instance. Americans known to be opponents of the conspiracy, including General Walker, prominent members of the John Birch Society, and leaders of other conservative organizations, began to receive threats of death by telephone from creatures who somehow knew that Kennedy was dead before he reached the hospital, wrote Oliver. I believe this detail is also spot on, in that Texas John Birch supporters put up $150,000 to pay the shooters, and were among the first notified of the mission's success. But salting that observation with the lie these calls included death threats to the paymasters is an obvious misdirection that recalls Edwin Stanton's efforts to claim he was a target of the Lincoln assassination conspiracy and not one of the instigators himself. Oliver was especially harsh on then director of the Council on Foreign Relations, the recently fired former CIA head, Allen Dulles. Dulles was head of an American spy ring in Switzerland during the Second World War, and is said to have done a fairly good job, began Oliver, although it was believed at the time that his organization was infested with double agents who were really in the employ of the Soviet, and even more serious implications can be drawn from the testimony given last July. A Soviet agent who had been Mr. Dulles' German counterpart and supposed competitor in Switzerland. Yes, Dulles was head of OSS in Europe and was posted in Switzerland and recruited the bulk of the Nazi spy network into the CIA in a secret surrender with the Malta knight Reinhard Gehlen, who was later rewarded by becoming head of the West German Secret Services. But Felf was a minor figure when posted in Switzerland compared with Dulles, just one of many spooks accepting pay from all comers. One writer has recently suggested that it was the CIA that arranged the assassination of Kennedy. I know of no evidence to support that opinion, but obviously Mr. Dulles' creation is open to some suspicion. Perhaps that is why he is a member of the Special Commission, wrote Oliver, in a brief and startling moment of spot-on clarity that was instantly jettisoned. Oliver claimed the commission would paint Comrade Oswald as a poor lone critter who done it all alone. Probably psychiatrists will be produced to prove he done it because at the age of 6 months he had to wait an extra 5 minutes for his bottle. Strange that Oswald was likely worked on by CIA psychiatrists while a teen in New York, prior to his being hypnotized by David Ferry while a member of Ferry's Civil Air Patrol in New Orleans. The fact he knew the outcome before the investigation began was yet another spot on. Oliver was called before the Warren Commission to testify, and I imagine that was a scripted encounter. Mark Lane was another one of the few independent investigators allowed to present evidence directly to the commission. It took me decades to realize Lane's testimony was likely scripted as well, for he was also a former OSS officer and was likely guided into a role as the premier debunker of the official story. He soon tainted himself by embracing Willis Carto's Holocaust denial movement. Isn't it strange that both Oliver and Lane were on polar opposites of the political divide, one far left, the other far right, and yet both believed in a Jewish conspiracy running the world? If you want to find a contemporary salter of disinfo, check out Jan Irvin, who treads in Oliver's footsteps with lies and distortions. Irvin produces propaganda supporting the theory that hippies were created by the CIA and that Tim, Larry, Ken Kesey, and me are employees of that agency and not its critics. Since I'm on the inside of this particular conspiracy theory, it's impossible for me to ignore Irvin is making this up. So I put him in the not trusted category. And wouldn't you know, he also believes Jews are running the system through some secret satanic cult based on the teachings of Aleister Crowley, which just confirms my suspicions Intel is exploiting Crowley for propaganda. But they do the same thing with their phony UFO evidence they're constantly manufacturing. Once you identify the principal polemicists salting Intel-sponsored propaganda, you're halfway to enlightenment. And once you identify the major memes those polemicists are salting, you can easily ID a lot more spooks and avoid their rabbit holes to nowhere. Anyone supporting obviously fake memes is either a spook or a hoodwinked true believer, and there is no other option. Spooks and true believers can't be trusted, so divide conspiracy research into two categories, trusted and not trusted, and learn from both categories. With practice and a keen eye for detail, you'll soon be learning more from the disinfo than the authentic intel, mostly because there's a lot more noise than signal. But you must avoid falling into the traps, what I call the rabbit holes, the biggest of which is racism in any form. The most powerful forces promoting ethnic cleansing are spook-driven, manufactured to assist the war-for-profit scenarios with their divide-and-conquer propaganda, something always easily identified. Here's my advice. Avoid any variation on the rabbit holes resembling communists are running the world, Jews are running the world, Satanists are running the world, the aliens are running the world, or the CIA created the hippies.